Why would God allow bad things to happen to good people? Why, if he's perfectly just, omnibenevolent, and all-powerful, why does he allow cataclysms, natural disasters to affect young and old, innocent and wicked alike? It doesn't seem to make sense from our perspective. Perhaps if we took a step back and looked at the ultimate consequences of everything that's happening, we would see that really it is for the best, that God did create the best of all possible worlds. That's a popular theological solution to the problem of evil. So when the 3-year-old girl dies in a flood, perhaps she's actually being spared from greater trauma, greater suffering that was going to affect her later on. She's being called up to heaven, and that was what was best for her. Perhaps, but the process of drowning, the process of dying, experiencing the pain that people experience, was that necessary in the first place? If we want to say that God has arranged things so that everything tallies up to the good in the end, and it just appears bad from our perspective, why didn't God set the equation in the first place such that no suffering was necessary? Why couldn't we all just exist in peace, abundance, basking in his perfect light? Why couldn't that be the case? Man's fall from grace, perhaps, was something that happened because God wanted to give us freedom. And if God made automata, it wouldn't mean much for us to exist. Our existence wouldn't have meaning and wouldn't matter. It just, it would be kind of a pointless existence if we only did what God wanted us to do all the time and never had our own will to explore. I can understand that, but if God knows ahead of time whether you are going to suffer in hell or go back to him and go to heaven, why would he create those souls which are doomed to eternal suffering? That doesn't seem to make sense, right? Not if predestination is true and God knows exactly where you're going at the end of the day. Why give those souls existence which are consigned to eternal suffering? And why create a world where power corrupts, where financial oligarchs parasite off of the majority of the people, where most people toil ceaselessly for the benefit of a small privileged minority that lives with surplus, that lives with excess? Why authorize that hierarchy? In Romans, Paul says that we should accept the authorities that are over us because God legitimates their authority. God has put them there for a reason. The Bible also says that currently the ruler of this world is Satan. So at the same time, it says that God authorizes the hierarchies that exist, the authority structures that exist, and those authority structures are headed by Satan. So effectively, God put Satan in charge of this world. How is that for the best? Why would that be the case? So we can look at the classical answers from a theological perspective. The idea that evil is essentially privatory, that it's a privation of the good and has no positive substance, and it only appears to be a reality because of our limited perspective on the whole. So in that sense, evil would be illusory and a factor of our having a finite knowledge of the world. Again, if we took a step back, we would see that actually it is the best possible world. But there seems to be a positive existence to evil, right? Suffering definitely exists. The finite experience of a suffering human being definitely exists. Um, Schopenhauer makes that critique of the best of all possible worlds argument, just saying how absurd it is and how basically cruel to the countless unfortunate souls of this world who do toil for their bread, who lose loved ones, die of cancer, like all of that. Are you going to dismiss it and say, well, you think that you're suffering, but really you're not? It seems ridiculous. And it also makes a mockery of the idea of eternal damnation and punishment in hell. So are they not really suffering? Is that still privatory? That's just kind of an absence of good. The burning of hell, is that a positive reality? You would think it would be. So Proclus, in the Neoplatonic school, looks at evil as, in a sense, privatory, but also more specifically parasitical. There are ways of gaining value that are possible only through harvesting the good that other creatures have, right? Like the farmer that sows seeds and then consumes the calories that those plants produce through photosynthesis. That's a form of parasitism. But the positive feelings that the farmer has sitting at his dinner table with his family, that wouldn't exist if that parasitism didn't exist. And so in order for the best of all possible worlds to exist, you have to have not only the good that comes from basking in God's unchanging perfect light, you also have to have the good that comes from some creatures consuming the good that other creatures have created. And yet, the suffering that creates would, in order for it to be the best possible world, would have to be ultimately illusory. Meaning, if you stepped back far enough, you would see that all of that suffering is canceled out by an inevitable return of all souls, of all creatures, back to the source of all good. That's in Proclus's system. Everything in reality cycles. You can see this in the Gnostic system as well. There's the pleroma, God's kingdom, where everything is perfect, everything is in accordance with God's order, and then there's the outlying kenoma, chaos, and Sophia, wisdom, out of its curiosity, out of her curiosity, goes into the kenoma to try to make sense of this chaos and bring order to it. But being the feminine, she imminently experiences the chaos and knows it viscerally, but then can't reassimilate it into the order of the pleroma. And so Christ, the masculine counterpart to Sophia, the Logos, the counterpart of Sophia, goes to recover that immanent wisdom that's gained in this visceral feminine sense. That's the myth of Orpheus in the underworld, or, it's also the myth that's told in the Bible of Lot and Lot's wife. The message is Sophia, the feminine, finds itself in this chaos, brings suffering onto itself. And suffering is ultimately the same as separation. The pleroma is good because it's all unified. So the one is the principle of the good, and separation is the principle of suffering. Sophia brings separation, fragmentation into herself. And then Christ, Logos, rejoins and unifies and introduces that once fragmented reality back into the pleroma, and therefore eternally expands the realm of the good. To do that, you need, as the masculine, not to fall into the trap of trying to appease Sophia where she is, not appeasing demonic forces where they are, but standing fast and allowing them to be drawn to you, because they do naturally seek the good which you contain. They'll naturally want to parasite off of it, because this is the nature of the expansion of the realm of the good, this parasitical process, where a creature with order descends into separation, into a chaotic psychology, chaotic state of affairs, and they sustain their existence by consuming whole products that are created in a kind of self-emanating way. Again, think of the farmer and the plant. The plant creates its own good. It is a unified whole. The farmer sustains its existence parasitically by consuming those wholes that it encounters. And so that's what evil will want to do with good. That's what evil wants to do with Christ. In the Bible, when Christ goes out into the desert and encounters temptation from Satan, Satan is trying to assimilate Christ, assimilate that order into his parasitical order. He wants to put Jesus in charge of the world in a secular sense, so that Jesus is brought into that demonic parasitical hierarchy. But to successfully bring Sophia back, to save the feminine, which is the eternal hero's journey, to descend into the underworld and reappropriate the goodness that is in all being, including those beings in the depths of hell. To go down and to return, you can't look back. Just like Lot does not look back at Sodom, but his wife does. And if you're looking to the feminine, if you're simping, you're going to get absorbed into the Kenoma, and you won't save the princess. You won't bring her home again. And that's ultimately the point. The reason that this state of affairs exists is that this is the best of all possible worlds, where viewed at the widest possible scope, all suffering, all apparent separation is illusory. The suffering, taking God's perspective, to man some things are good, to God all things are good. From God's perspective, everything is unified because nothing is outside of his scope. Everything is contained in God. Because he's omnipresent, there's nothing outside of God. And so for him, all things are brought together in goodness, but only from his perspective. From our perspective, the suffering is real, and the trial is real, and the work is real, and all of that effort is real. And that's the fuel of further creation. God's goodness is super abundantly good, not just this fixed, finite amount of good, but an ever-expanding, infinite amount of good that at the same time is static, because it's beyond statics and dynamics. It's beyond any human category. That's the idea of apophatic theology. We can only describe God by negation, by saying he's not a shoe, he's not a squirrel, he's something else than that. And so we go to the broadest human categories, finite, infinite, self, other, and we get to this idea of the ineffable, of something that is prior to underlying any possible category. But yeah, so for that being, everything is good. For us, some things are evil. Now, on that parasitical elite that rule this world, they have to exist, and God has put Satan in charge of this world, because a world that complexifies through separation and then unification is greater in some sense than a world that never separated and existed in a static state. So, with a parasitical global hierarchy, the earth can be reconfigured in some way and then saved from dominion by Satan once that separation and complexification has taken place. And then recalling everything back will result in a greater goodness. Also, just logically, if God wants to create the best of all possible worlds, and if he's the best possible being, why wouldn't he create the best of all possible worlds? Then he's going to create an infinite amount of experience. So the descent into chaos is potentially infinite. In that sense, hell is potentially eternal. Right? Eternal damnation is real, and yet at the same time, all souls are always ultimately brought back, ultimately do cycle back, just like Proclus says. That's not a contradiction, because for the maximum possible experience to exist, a branching of worlds has to take place. God knows, this is Molinism, God knows all possible paths you could take, and so predestination is a sense true, right? God knows the map of where you might go, but where you go is always a product of your will. So your free will leads you down those paths into further separation. And if you keep on messing up, you could experience an infinite amount of time descending into hell. And yet, based on the infinite extent of that map of possible experience, there's always a path back. You never have to take it, but at all times, there is a path back to God. So, we are in a position where a global parasitical elite is rising, has been rising for some time. And they do commune with demonic entities. And if you don't believe that, you don't know anything about them. This stuff has been going on not just since the medieval period, and not since the Masons and the Illuminati, and not since, there's all sorts of occultists in the Western tradition. The mystery schools in Greece, there were dark mysteries as well, and they did, what do you think the oracles were? Who were they talking to? Who were they trying to commune with? People, elites, have been engaged in child sacrifice since the days of, Babylon and Phoenicia, more importantly. The dark arts are ancient, and they have allowed a group of people, a tribe, ultimately, going back thousands of years, they've allowed a group to gain power parasitically over others. That's how demonic hierarchies work. The principle of a demonic hierarchy is parasitism. And that's also the principle of our financial system, usury. I create through a claim on your labor. That's how I'm able to create this money in fractional reserve banking. The good that I experience in my bottom line increasing is a result of me saying that effectively whatever you produce, some part of it is mine. Slavery. And you bring people into that system by promising them a favorable position vis-a-vis others. Just like Jesus was promised the world. Just like any politician or rock star or whatever. Anyone brought into the beast system that is ultimately serving Satan's agenda is promised a leg up on others. That's how the Roman hierarchy in terms of slaves worked. There were some slave revolts. Why didn't it happen more often? Because the slaves in the field wanted to be the slaves in the household that were treated better, that weren't whipped. And so they wanted to get on top of the other slaves. And that's how we feel. People in the lower class resent people in the middle who they can see, who they know, and they want to be placed above them. And so they'll cooperate with a demonic power structure that wants total parasitical global control. They will cooperate with that and turn a blind eye to any violations of freedom, human rights, whatever. They'll turn a blind eye to what that higher level government does in order to be placed above their rivals in the middle class. Demons are constantly fighting with each other to get on top of one another in this demonic hierarchy. But all of their labor, all of their effort, all of their suffering is channeled into the good experienced by the high-level demons. And why would they go for this if they knew the dynamics underlying all these processes that I'm describing? All right, my hypothesis in terms of mundane history is that there was an advanced civilization originating probably around the Azores Islands, likely related to the Solutrean culture. They were if you haven't looked at Dennis Stanford's lectures on the Solutrean, you should. The evidence is pretty compelling that like the Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania and several other sites on the East Coast, early Clovis sites, they show the continuity between Solutrean and the later stuff. Of course, they would cover this up, not only because it undermines the claim of the Siberian Americans to this territory in a sense, but also because it would expose that there was an advanced group crossing the Atlantic right in that time frame when Atlantis was supposed to exist. And so I think some of them got to the Azores Islands, the ones that mastered the shipbuilding technology. I think their power probably goes much further back than that, because I know the prehistoric record. I know the fossils that exist. And I look at early advanced sites like, the Skull and Kafsa hominids, their industry in Palestine. I look at the Kafsa rock shelter in Morocco, the Blombos Cave in South Africa, and I see there was before the last interglacial period, which went from roughly like 20,000, it was getting warmer until about 12,000 BC. So that was one flourishing that was like the Atlantean civilization age. I think there was much older proto-civilization periods. And not to say that there was advanced technology. The Atlanteans didn't have advanced technology per se in the way that we understand it. I think they did develop some technology using sound. You can look at the singing stones from South Africa and a bunch of other stuff on the whole sound-based technology. But in principle, you could capture resonant frequencies from the earth using large stone structures. So why were they experts in megalithic construction? Where do the megalithic builders actually come from? There's the record that we know of just starts with Göbekli Tepe out of nowhere, but there's obviously some preceding period where this actually developed. So there's a lot of data from the Paleolithic that suggests there was some more advanced group. Not advanced technology by our standards, perhaps, but they were operating in ways that allowed them to travel around the world and also map the world, right? There are ancient maps that were passed down from yet more ancient sources that seem to describe the coastlines of North and South America as they were during that last Ice Age period. And if you've just seen the Piri Reis map, you might not give credence to it. There are several other maps, and the people who copied these maps in Anatolia in the classical period said they got these maps from more ancient sources. And the Phoenicians, where did they come from? Why did they have the most advanced shipbuilding technology? Before them, the civilization of Dilmun in modern-day Bahrain, where did they come from? Why did they, in myth, give rise to the Sumerian elite? There's a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of anomalies that suggest there was a more advanced group traveling around the world that had shipbuilding, cartography, some knowledge of something like astrology. Or the thing with astrology is the data is not so strong, suggesting that it's an accurate predictive tool, but that does not mean it isn't a powerful prescriptive tool. Think about it. You would want to establish these generational patterns so that you could make it predictable, so that you could make social dynamics predictable, so that you could engineer it more effectively. It's just common sense. It's like if you play Super Smash Brothers, if you are always reactive, you're going to lose. You're definitely going to lose if you don't change the state of affairs, especially in a multiplayer game. When there's 4 people running around the map, you have to move the most. You have to make the most stuff happen so that you have the best predictive ability. If you are the most active party, you create the patterns that exist in your environment. You have the best ability to predict them because the patterns that emerge are emerging out of the patterns that already exist in your own will, right? I know what I want to do. I know what I'm doing in Super Smash Brothers, and therefore I can predict to a greater extent what's going to happen because I'm setting these things in motion. So I think astrology originated as a kind of social engineering technology during that Atlantean phase. And not just that, the generational cycle that Strauss and Howe observes, the fourth turning, I don't think that's predictive either. I think it's prescriptive. And I think these generational crises are orchestrated. And how could they possibly keep this sort of thing secret? Well, again, I'm saying that they have communed with demonic entities. They have tried, we know that these cultures where the elites actually reside have tried to communicate with demons. So if reality is this vast thing, if there are other consciousnesses in other realms, and some are intensely parasitical worlds, and some are worlds within the pleroma, within heaven, that are following God's logos voluntarily. If that's the case, these demons are out there. Now, how could they, in principle, communicate with us? How could you engage in interdimensional communication? For that, well, there's a bunch of different angles you could take. One is the idea that the seat of consciousness is in what is described as Hilbert space, in like identifying the wave function, the universal wave function, like all wave functions describing all motion of all matter that we know of. Everything obeys the Schrödinger equation. Well, the superposition of all wave functions of all different things that happen exist together in Hilbert space in a kind of unified field. That's the idea in modern physics. So this unified field is the seat of consciousness. Things emerge from that unified field into experience through a kind of conscious projection. Sounds mystical, but you can get into the physics. You can get into, Henry Stapp, I disagree with in some small ways, but you could look at the Hameroff-Penrose model that's compatible with this. Even, what's his name? He did reality, the case against reality, forgetting this guy's name. But it's the idea that consciousness merges through, or rather reality merges through like a network of conscious observation. You can get very specific and scientific with all of this stuff, looking at a way that entities, consciousnesses could exert an influence. I have my own theory about how, and it's compatible as well. But I'm not going to get into that without trying to write this stuff down. And when I get out the whiteboard or when I do it on the computer, not as many people watch those videos and it's harder for people to understand. And I've said before, I'll explain this stuff. If you want to learn it, I'll explain it to you. But virtually no one has taken me up on that. So that just tells you the state of affairs. Like, people don't want the truth. At least the people watching these videos, the people in these spheres. There are communities where they're going after this stuff. Like, people are interested in the Hameroff-Penrose model. People are interested in, I wish this guy's name would come to me, but anyway, there's a few different strains of modern day idealism and things along those lines that are scientifically robust, getting more interesting. You should follow those fields and see what's going on there. But people are stuck in like the patterns of thought they're comfortable with. Anyway, assuming for the sake of argument that there is a possibility of communion with demonic or angelic entities through particular kinds of ritual, getting yourself into a certain kind of conscious state, then the demons could maintain the continuity of these power structures. There's also the possibility of guided reincarnation. The idea that we can steer whether we go to a heaven or hell implies that we have some degree of control over the process of reincarnation, which means in principle it's engineerable. And there could be souls on this earth alive today that remember their past lives, and there could be a kind of elite club of high-level demons that look like humans but really remember their past going back on Earth and perhaps on other more advanced demonic realms. So that's how, in principle, it could happen. There's also mundane biological ways that knowledge could be passed down, blood knowledge, like the way that Jews kind of just know how to organize innately. They don't have to be taught. There doesn't have to be a conspiracy. They just kind of end up cooperating, something like that. But that's just my thoughts on the global elite. They have to exist to create the global situation that will be setting the stage for the return of Christ, and we should all be ready for that return. Talk to me though, and thank you guys for listening.